Hello everyone, welcome to Northern Aeronautical. My name is McCoy, and in this video I wanted to start a weekly series of videos regarding what Northern Aeronautical has been achieved or what has been achieving in the past week since that upload of the video. And so this will be this first video of this series, and so we're going to be going over, or in each video we'd be going over what projects we may have dropped, what projects we may have added, and just our progress between each of the projects, ongoing projects, and what we've achieved in between them. And so that is going to be the basic gist of this series. And what's particularly good about this video is that it's been 3 months, almost 3 months, since our last upload. And that's not a good thing, but this video is particularly good for that because we will be able to cover what exactly we have been up to. I'll be able to double down on that. And then in the next videos in the series, it will just be the amount we did in that week or 2 weeks, depending on how frequently I upload these. Hopefully every week, that's the goal. So this week, aka 3 months, we have done quite a bit. Even though we've been silent, we've been doing a lot more than we usually have been doing. We have just been ramping up on progress. And so in the last video we left off, we were talking about a grid fin stabilization rocket. So basically we'd be using these little fin things called grid fins to stabilize the rocket. And I'm sure they're quite familiar to many spaceflight community members who look at stuff, thinking about the Falcon 9 with its grid fins, so a lot of you might know about that. But anyways, if you'd like to learn more about those, you can watch that video. But that rocket called Beagle, we dropped it. Not the idea of using a grid fin rocket, but that particular rocket in that video that I discussed, we dropped because there was quite a few things wrong with it. Or I guess not wrong at the time, but as I worked on other rockets, particularly Ranger, I discovered some better ways to improve it. And so I didn't want to fly a poorly built rocket when I can improve it. So I'm starting from scratch. I'm going to be completely redesigning every aspect of it to make it much lighter, because that's the main issue I have with it. It was very heavy for its size. It was bulky, not so well put together, and I put a lot of layers of paint on that because I messed up quite a few times, so I had to hide it, and that added a lot of weight too, and also wasted a lot of paint. So I have dropped that rocket and going to start a new one. Another project that we have talked about quite a bit is our Ranger rocket. And the last time we showed it was exactly this. And we haven't done anything more on this particular rocket because we also have dropped this rocket as well. Not Ranger, but just this particular rocket again, like Beagle. Because again, it's very heavy for what it is. This cardboard tube weighs quite a bit, and then we put aluminum tape on it, and that just adds a lot more weight. And so drop this rocket, but I have already built and flown the next one in that, which is Ranger 3. And this is Ranger 3, and it does not look very good. Its fuselage is now fully 3D printed. That reduces the weight quite a bit, which is a little counterintuitive. You'd think a plastic tube might be heavier than just a cardboard tube, but with 3D printing, we were able to get it down super thin, but also be pretty strong and even a little flexible to reduce when it impacts, it doesn't get as damaged. But that doesn't make very much sense when you see all this dentage, all this damage. And that is because the flight was a pretty big failure. It wasn't a complete failure, but it was a pretty bad failure. And so I'll go ahead and play a video of that. And as you can see, it launches up, but it just explodes in a way. A lot of smoke comes out. You might even be able to see that the rocket motor flies out. And then it hits the ground and doesn't achieve a very high altitude. And that is because the NE7 rocket motor that we use, so here is the NE7, and what happened was it was burning fine at liftoff, but then we have a stopper at the top. Right now It's just empty, so you can see that, but we have a bulkhead to hold in all that combustion inside of it. But it got a little too high pressure, and that bulkhead wasn't fully secured into the motor, and so that pressure shot it out, and instead of using this as a nozzle, it decided to use the now exposed opening as a nozzle. And so all of that exhaust shot out the back of the motor, and so you can imagine when this motor is inside this rocket. So here we have the motor in there. And so it shot all that exhaust out and into this tube, which then it was very hot exhaust because it was just burning in a rocket motor. And since this is plastic, it melted this entire tube all over the place. And then it kind of gets sharp around here, particularly because the plastic was still very soft when it hit the grass. So just even grass was able to slice into that. The ground, the shape of the ground dented it a bunch. And so the rocket is not in the best shape, and so it won't be flying anymore. And so we then went on to make Ranger 4, which we have also made partially. It is still missing its nose cone and a few other things like the flight computer and stuff. But anyways, this is Ranger 4, the next rocket in its in the Ranger family. And so a few things that we have updated is the fin can in particular. Instead of having an open and exposed area where an exhaust from the rocket motor can go into the tube and damage it, we have blocked that off with a bulkhead. We also Swiss cheesed it a bunch to reduce the weight. And there's not much other difference between the two. They are pretty similar side by side, but the top has a different mounting ring, and that is because this rocket, you may have seen in the video, uses fairings, and when it lifted off, one of those fairings opened up, which would have really messed up the flight, and those fairings were just not very reliable. And so I decided to drop the fairing idea and go back to our piston ejection system. And so I have updated the design of the piston mechanism to make it smaller and lighter because it was pretty heavy in the past, in the previous system, and I'll be making a more in-depth video on the second iteration. I know I said I would make a video on the first, but soon after saying that, I redesigned it and made a second. And so I'll be making a video about that. And this rocket will be using that piston mechanism, which basically is just a piston. It shoots a rod with a flat top to knock off the nose cone with a parachute inside. So that is Ranger and where it's at. And regarding the NE7 in the Ranger in the previous flight where things got explosive, after that flight is most likely the very last time one of these rocket motors will be flown. And that is because they're just a pain to deal with. As you can have seen in that flight, it just adds a lot of unknowns and causes it to fail. They are also not the highest performance rocket motor. Their thrust or their ranking in ISP is around or total impulse is around a D10 rocket motor, D12. So it's not a super powerful rocket motor. And it's just a lot easier just to go and buy a D12 because you can buy them in packs of 2 for 5, 6, 7, I think 10, I don't know, but pretty cheap. And it's just a lot easier to just go out and buy a rocket motor instead of 3D printing it, fueling it, and then possibly having it fail because it is not a fully tested commercial motor. And so that is the end of the NE7, which was it's a motor we're pretty proud of because it's fully 3D printed, fully plastic, and just really easy in a way. Obviously it's not easy as I just explained, but it's simple. But that is the end of the NE7. That doesn't mean we're stopping making rocket motors though. We will continue making rocket motors F class and above because that's when F motors is when it starts getting pretty pricey, and it's just a lot, in my opinion at least, to make it because you won't need a ton of F motors if you're just doing flights to a few hundred feet like with the Ranger, we're not going to go super high. It's just to test the flight computer and such. And so that is the end of the NE7. We will continue making rocket motors though, F-class and above. And so that brings me on to what we have been doing with our rocket motors. And we have done quite a few different motors in that time. We've done some testing with the NE8, which is the predecessor of the NE7, and we only tested it once or twice because it didn't show any better than the NE7. It was pretty much just a scaled up NE7. Instead of 18 millimeters, it was 24, so a little bit bigger. We're done making that rocket motor as well because it had a tendency to explode. It got really, really high pressure. And so we're done doing the NE8. And then the NE9 is a different motor, and that is a rocket motor comparable to our NE3 rocket motor. We haven't done very much about that, but I will go ahead and show a video of that testing. And so the NE9 uses plaster as a nozzle. And so here is that exact motor. I have some electrical tape on it for mounting. But anyways, here's that motor. And instead of being fully 3D printed, we just 3D printed the casing, and then we cast the nozzle with plaster. And as you can see in the video, it exploded. The first one we did was just a slow burner, and it's not very neat to watch. But anyways, the NE9 was our next attempt to make an F-class or above. This motor, though, probably would have been maybe on the border of an F-class, but most likely an E. Not much special. In a way, it's a scaled up NE7, just not using plastic as a nozzle instead of plaster, which can deal with those higher temperatures and not have as much nozzle erosion. But that rocket motor is done for as well. Pouring that plaster is just a pain. If we were to make bigger rocket motors, we'll continue using the plaster, but it is 24 millimeters like the NE8, and it's, in my opinion, just not worth it to deal with it anymore. And so we go on to the NE10. And the NE10 is sort of a mix between a lot of our rocket motors in the past. It is pretty much a hybrid between our very first rocket motors, the Fiedler, and in that aspect, it being partially reusable. And then it is also a way, sort of like the NE3, which it shares a lot of dimensions with, a lot of stuff we learned from the NE3 program. And then it also shares some stuff from the NE7, being fully 3D printed and what we learned through there. But as I've mentioned, being fully 3D printed comes with a lot of drawbacks, particularly with nozzle erosion. So if you think of like a river, over time, water erodes the sides of the river and makes a bigger river. The same thing goes on with the inside of a rocket motor. And so the nozzle, which is the throat of the nozzle, the hole that you see in there where the gas passes through and is sped up with the rest of the nozzle and then shot out, that opens up, but over a very short duration, especially with plastic, because you have super, super fast, super hot, high pressure gas flowing through it. And especially with it being plastic, that doesn't mix with those. And so it just shreds through it. And we lose performance because the nozzle changes shape and it's no longer optimized for the chamber pressure. And so our answer to that, while still being fully 3D printed, and being particularly large, because on a smaller rocket motor, we can deal with that. They're only burning for maybe a second, two. But if you're going for 5 seconds, plastic isn't going to do very well. And so what we did was we switched to a multi-nozzle rocket motor. And so that is the NE10. And I'll go ahead and play a video of the very first one. And so in the ignition, you first see 4 flames, which means there's 4 nozzles. And so basically the idea behind that is instead of passing all that gas through one singular nozzle, we can split it apart to just 4. And that way, one singular nozzle doesn't have to deal with as much flow. And that way, there's less nozzle erosion per nozzle. And if we continue the video, you see that it begins leaking out the sides and it just erupts in a fireball. And that is because where the fuselage or the casing of the rocket motor and the nozzle section meet, they weren't fully sealed well, and so instead of going through the nozzles, the flames could go through there and through that seam. And so we went on to make a new version, which I will play now. And that is a dual nozzle. As you see, there's two flames, but it then explodes. And here I have the nozzle of that, so you can see both nozzles. And that's about it. I lost the casing because it shot way off, but it overpressurized and shot off the back. And that is most likely because these nozzles, they're very tiny. They're only 2 millimeters each. And so I'll be increasing that to about 3.2 millimeters. And that way, or maybe 3.5, depending on figuring out that. But that way it will reduce pressure. We might even have to go back to the 4 nozzle variant if that issue with the pressure continues. So hopefully that'll fix that, and we will have a multi-nozzle rocket motor, fully 3D printed too, which is kind of cool. I really like the look of multiple flames coming out. Another rocket motor that we've been working on, this one doesn't necessarily have an any number designation. That is because it is not supposed to propel a rocket. It is a spin motor. So a lot of rockets stabilize themselves instead of using fins. I'm thinking more missiles, even bullets. They spin themselves because that gyroscopic force keeps it stabilized, because with it going spinning, it takes a lot of energy to move it off that course. And so we made a motor where it has a nozzle on one side pointing this way and another nozzle on the other side pointing in the opposite direction. And there is a center combustion chamber which has pipes going into both nozzles, and that way when that fuel ignites in that combustion chamber, exhaust shoots that way, exhaust shoots that way, instead of pushing it one way or the other, because they're counteracting, but they're not aligned with the center of mass, and so it's going to spin it up to that roll to get it stabilized. And that is the idea behind this motor. We have tested a few. This is the final design because it was successful, and I'll go ahead and play a video of that. As you can see, it shoots exhaust out both sides and then stops or spins up, but stops because the stand has a stopper so it doesn't keep on spinning. But hopefully that will spin up this rocket right here. And as you can see, there is a spin motor right here. I'll go ahead and take that out with some mounting pieces. But there's the spin motor that goes in this rocket. It will fly on a C6. This spin motor will spin it up, and that way it will fly without any fins. It has these tiny little fins, but those are more for looks. And that is the idea behind that rocket, and that is another thing we have been working on. And then there is another motor we have been working on, and you might even be able to call it an engine because it has moving parts, the NE-11. And this isn't necessarily supposed to be something to fly with on a rocket. It is just a jet engine looking thing. Really, it's a glorified butane torch. It is a turbine on the front, pushes air, sucks it in, into a combustion chamber where we have some zappers that zap that air, where we inject butane fuel, and it causes combustion, and then you get a cool flame out the back. So it's kind of like an EDF afterburner, but the fan itself isn't supposed to produce the thrust, and so that kind of degrades the idea of being an EDF. And as you can see in the videos, the flame looks cool, got the green and blue, but it isn't particularly special. It's not super strong, and so our answer to that is the next variant, where we have a much bigger area where we suck in the air. We now have an aluminum combustion chamber, and we're going to be putting on a much better motor inside there. And it will ignite the same way. It uses a taser zapper thing, a stun gun kind of deal, and butane as fuel. And hopefully this one might even produce thrust, but get a cooler combustion looking flame. And that pretty much sums up exactly what we have been doing in those past 3 months. I can't think of anything else in particular. Gamma, Cameron's rocket, he is now working on Gamma Light, which is a lighter version, so he can get it up to higher altitudes. And I am also making a new rocket to kind of compete with Gamma Light. It's going to be a super light, smaller diameter, same size as Beagle, and it's most likely going to be called Javelin. And the idea is to get as high altitude as possible. And that is why I'm making the NE10, is to get that longer burn, high thrust, to shoot that up to high altitudes, to high speeds too. And as well, a long burn just to look cool. And so that's all the development I can think of that has been going on with Northern Aeronautical. And so that's just the past 3 months. And now we're going to be moving on to just weekly videos. So it's not going to be as long because this video is pretty long. And I did not want it to go this long, but there has been a lot to cover because I have been procrastinating about uploading content. And that is my bad, and I apologize for that. But that's what's happening. And thank you for watching. I will be uploading a few more videos soon to cover a bit more of the specifics about what we talked about. But that's about it. Thanks for watching.